I'm going to have a go at making a series of videos that's just a little bit outside my comfort zone. If you follow me on Twitch, or if you subscribe to my channel here, you know that my content is primarily video game based. And that's all well and good. I'm never going to change that. My primary method of interacting with you guys is probably always going to be via Twitch, playing video games and talking bullshit about video games and stuff like that. But I wanted to do something a bit new. Lockdown, this pandemic, and being made redundant have given me nothing but time to read about stuff and kind of explore other avenues of content creation that interest me. And that's what this is going to be. I'm going to make a series of videos that focus on people who may be alive or may be dead, but during their time on this planet did some absolutely outrageous things. Most of the people that I'm going to be focusing on will have done some bad shit in their time, but some of them might have done some good. Some of them you might have some respect for. Most of them you'll probably loathe, but they will all have done something batshit crazy or something pretty interesting. And I'm going to keep this series going for as long as I find it interesting, for as long as you guys find it interesting. And I'm just going to kind of see what happens with it. In this first episode, we're going to talk about a person and a group of people who I think should really be more widely known about, considering the stuff that they did. When I was doing research into this series, and when I was asking people if they'd be interested in seeing stuff like this, the number of them that did not know that this group existed is ridiculous to me. They should be very well known for the stuff that they did, but they're not. This is the Carnage Collective. Grab yourself a coffee, grab yourself a cup of tea, or if you're me and you're a bit nervous about public speaking and making this kind of thing makes you really uneasy, and it's episode 1, grab yourself a beer and strap yourself in, because we're starting strong. The first initiate to the Carnage Collective, Shiro Ishii and Unit 731. Shiro Ishii was born in the summer of 1892 in Shibayama, Japan. He was the 4th son to a local landowner and sake merchant, Katsuya Ishii. Now, owning land during this particular point in Japanese history was a pretty big deal. It meant you were doing really okay for yourself, and it also meant that you were considered quite upper class. So it's safe to say that Shiro's upbringing was pretty good for a kid of the era, and it meant that he probably wouldn't have wanted for anything. He would have gone to good schools and had clothes and food and all of the stuff that we kind of have now, but was pretty sparse at the time. Unfortunately, though, not a huge amount more is known about his upbringing outside of the fact that it weren't a poor one. Ishii began his studies at the Chiba Imperial School in Chiba City before moving on to the 4th high school in Kanazawa, Ishikawa Prefecture. From here, he graduated and was accepted into the Kyoto Imperial University, where he began his studies in medicine. In 1921, Ishii began his long military career after he was commissioned into the Japanese Imperial Army as a military surgeon, with a rank of Army Surgeon 2nd Class. In 1922, Ishii was assigned to the 1st Army Hospital and Medical School in Tokyo, which is where he continued to hone his craft as a surgeon. In the 2 years that Ishii was here, his work didn't go unnoticed either. Some of his work was so impressive to some of his superiors that he was actually recommended for postgraduate medical schooling back at the Kyoto Imperial University. So in 1925, Ishii is back at Kyoto Imperial University studying postgraduate medicine. And one of the things that people noticed during this period of time was that Ishii kept a number of pets, as he would call them. Now, that's not weird, is it? You keep a dog, a cat, a fish, I don't know, parrot, whatever. A pet rock even. But no, Ishii was growing strains of deadly bacteria in petri dishes and referring to them as pets. It was also noted that he would rather hang out with these petri dishes full of deadly bacteria than actual people. Bit weird, but I suppose not really, because I guess in any university dorm there's going to be like a bowl with 7-year-old beans under the bed or whatever, so I guess it's not that weird. By 1927, Ishii finished his second stint at the Kyoto Imperial University and is now quite loudly advocating for the creation of a Japanese bioweapons program. In 1928, he begins a 2-year tour of the West where he did extensive research into developments of biological weapons and chemical weapons from World War I onwards. Shiro visited a lot of Europe during his time travelling, and he paid particular interest to Germany. Specifically, he wanted to learn as much as he could about the gases that were used against the Allies in World War I. Your mustard gases, your chlorine, things like that. He also looked at things like anthrax and other stuff, but primarily here he was looking at gases. And our boy Shiro weren't an idiot. He realised quite quickly that any modern military after World War I would be equipped with gas masks as a standard because of the gases that were used. And so any form of biological weapon that was in a gaseous form was pointless. He's a smart fucker. Like, the gears are turning. Ishii on top. In 1930, Ishii returned to Japan and was promoted to Army Surgeon First Class. Now, his travels were hugely successful, and they helped him to win over the Japanese minister for the army, Sadao Araki. Ishii's travels and what he learned in them were also pivotal in him receiving the backing of Araki's main rival within the military, a Major General Tetsuzan Nagata. Now, this guy was considered later on to be Ishii's most active and vocal supporter at the Khabarovsk war crime trials. And yeah, we'll get there. You heard me right though, war crime trials. We're dealing with war crimes. Stick with me here. In September of 1931, the Japanese military began an invasion of Manchuria, China. And it successfully occupied Manchuria until the end of the Second World War. And it was here that the Japanese government set up a puppet state, Manchukuo. And it was Manchukuo where the story of Unit 731 begins. Ishii's influence had continued to grow with every rung of the military ladder that he climbed. He was such a powerful figure in Parliament now that he was able to personally approach the Emperor of Japan and request funding to build a facility within Manchukuo whose sole purpose was to study diseases and create some pretty gnarly pathogens and weapons of mass destruction. Now, the Emperor knew that in wartime, the person who holds the biggest stick usually wins the biggest fight, and so he agreed to it. And soon after, construction on a massive compound began within the region. Officially, this was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit. Now, I imagine that's probably got something to do with the fact that you can't actually advertise that you're looking to create diseases and superviruses and weapons of mass destruction to wipe out the enemies of the Empire. Unofficially, though, it was known as Unit 731 or Detachment 731 or the 731st Regiment, the Camo Detachment, Ishii Unit, Ishii Company. It had a bunch of names, but primarily it was known as Unit 731. Construction was finished on the facility in 1935, and it started out as a research unit that was investigating the effects of disease and injury on the fighting ability of a Japanese soldier, but evolved quite quickly into something so much more gross. One element of the unit that took this far beyond medical ethics would observe injuries and the course of diseases inflicted on living patients. Now, at first, these living patients were just volunteers from within the Japanese military, but as these experiments became more invasive and the volunteers started to dry up, the unit began to use what it had at hand, which was Chinese prisoners of war and civilians within the puppet state. So as the concept of consent went out the fucking window, so did the researchers' restraint. It was around this time that Unit 731 started referring to their confined test subjects as Maruta, which literally translates to logs in English. And I'm going to get into some of the things that they did now, some of the tests that they performed. So if you're a bit squeamish and you don't like hearing about this sort of thing, might be time to, chip off. Might not be for you here. You've been warned. It's gross. Have the squeamish folk gone? Are we alone here? Cool. Let's start with vivisection then. Now, technically speaking, vivisection is just open surgery. Sure, I get that. But at Unit 731, vivisection meant they were going to open you up like a tin of beans with no anesthesia whatsoever administered. So you were completely aware of what was happening, and you were completely awake the entire time and could feel absolutely everything that they were doing. Thousands of men and women, mostly Chinese communist prisoners, as well as children and elderly farmers, were deliberately infected with diseases like cholera or the plague. Yes, the plague. Just so they could be cut open while still alive, so we could remove their organs and see what effects those diseases were having on living organs without any decomposition that occurs after death. In other instances of hellish vivisection, some prisoners had their limbs cut off and reattached in various positions. So, for example, your right arm on your left arm on your right leg on your third leg. Other people had their limbs slowly crushed to test the limits of the human body and to test their durability. Some people had the circulation cut off to test gangrene and how that could be fixed, possibly. Now, the reason that no anaesthetic was ever used in any of these vivisections or any of the other experiments that Unit 731 did was out of fear that it might contaminate the results of the tests that they were doing. So, for example, if you anaesthetize somebody who has, I don't know, the fucking plague or something, that might contaminate the organs that they were trying to get a look at. At least that's the reason that they gave. Inevitably, though, when a prisoner's body was all used up, they would typically be shot or burned alive or buried alive or killed by lethal injection or disposed of in any number of pretty gross ways. In almost all instances, though, the bodies would be burned. This was one of the reasons why they were referred to as maruta, or logs, because they'd be burned to ashes. One of the physiologists that was assigned to Unit 731 was a guy called Hisato Yoshimura. Now, this guy paid particular interest into studies around hypothermia and how feasible it was to rescue a limb that had succumbed to frostbite. The way that he would do this is that he would routinely take prisoners out into the middle of winter with a bunch of guards, and he'd have these guards fully submerge a limb, a leg, an arm, whatever, in water, or he would tie prisoners to posts and have guards pour water onto an exposed limb until a sheet of ice had formed around whatever limb he was working on. It was later reported that the limbs were frozen so solid that when they were struck by a cane, they sounded like a plank of wood. Once Hisato was satisfied that a limb had been completely frozen solid, he would then try varying methods of trying to re-thaw that limb to see if it was still good or could be used again. Some of the ways that he would do this would be he would pour various temperature waters over a limb, so ranging from lukewarm to boiling hot. Sometimes he would completely submerge that limb again in boiling hot water. Sometimes he would put somebody close to a fire. Sometimes he would leave people just by themselves at room temperature in their rooms with frozen limbs to see how they thawed. So a lot of the prisoners who were sent to Unit 731 ended up out in the middle of the countryside tied to stakes. And it was here that the unit would test various new pathogens on them and new biological weapons. So this could be anything from new plague cultures that they had created in their labs to bombs that were filled with plague-infested fleas. And it was here that most of the fatalities from the unit came from. So you remember earlier how I mentioned that they were doing research around the durability of people's limbs? Well, there was a research team whose sole purpose within the unit was to do tests around pressure. So they would take prisoners and lock them in pressure chambers to see how many pounds of pressure it would take until their eyes popped out or their blood burst from their veins. Now we're going to move on to probably one of the most disgusting aspects of Unit 731, and that was the experimentation that they did specifically involving women. You can probably tell where this is going. A lot of the female prisoners were forced into pregnancy for experimentation. The reason that was given for these forced pregnancies were that they wanted to test diseases like syphilis and things like that to see if the mother would pass that disease down to the child. Now, although a large number of babies were definitely born at Unit 731, there is no evidence whatsoever of any of them surviving. Unfortunately, the researchers didn't give a shit about people living through this experience. Everyone died, regardless of if they were old, young, newborn, doesn't matter. Nobody came out of this place alive. One of the guards that oversaw some of these experiments later testified at the war crime trials that followed the collapse of the unit after World War II. This is what he said in his testimony. Infection of venereal disease by injection was abandoned, and the researchers started forcing the prisoners into some sexual acts with each other. 4 or 5 unit members dressed in white lab clothing, completely covering the body with only the eyes and mouth visible, handled the tests. A male and a female, one infected with syphilis, would be brought together in a cell and forced into sex with each other. It was made clear that anyone resisting would be shot. While male prisoners did have it hard, obviously, they were only usually used in single studies at a time. Reason being that the researchers didn't want their results to be clouded by other variables that could have been thrown up by other experiment types. Women had it far worse. They were used in multiple experiment types at the same time. So bacteriological experiments, physiological experiments, sexual experiments, experiments on fetuses and newborn babies. Unfortunately as well, being a woman meant that you were also probably going to be the victim of a sex crime while you were a prisoner at Unit 731. Later on at the war crime trials that followed the collapse of the unit and the surrender of the Japanese government in World War II, a testimony was given by a guard who oversaw the prison, and you could probably tell that I'm quite uncomfortable with what I'm about to read. I'm about to read you his testimony, and I gotta say, it's pretty fucking gnarly. So if you're squeamish about this sort of thing, maybe fast forward to 30 seconds or something. One of the researchers told me that one day he had a human experiment scheduled, but there was still time to kill, so he and another unit member took the keys to the cells and opened one that housed a Chinese woman. One of the unit members raped her. The other unit member took the keys and opened another cell. There was a Chinese woman in there who had been used in one of Yoshimura's frostbite experiments. She had several fingers missing and her bones were black with gangrene set in. He was about to rape her anyway when he saw that her sex organ was festering with pus oozing to the surface. He gave up, locked the door and left, and later went on to his experiment. How nice of you, guy, to not rape the woman whose puss was oozing with pus. Good job. In 1942, Unit 731 developed dispersal techniques for germ warfare using their biological weapons. These were operationally tested in Chinese cities on civilians. What they would do is they would take these biological weapons, have low-flying planes fly over Chinese cities with huge populations, and they would drop nasty pathogens like cholera, anthrax, the bubonic plague, really nasty stuff. And they wouldn't do this on military bases or anything like that. They would deliberately fly over cities with massive populations to infect as many people with these diseases as possible. There was a team within Unit 731 whose sole purpose was to breed plague-infested fleas. These fleas were then weaponized into flea bombs. These bombs and other devices that were used to spread deadly pathogens and diseases were routinely dropped on civilian and military targets throughout the entirety of World War II. Ishii also had water sources and food crops infected. He also poisoned food and candy and had this distributed among the poverty-stricken populace around Unit 731, who would absolutely take it up because they mistook it for an act of kindness from the Japanese military. After they ate this stuff, though, the victims were either experimented on or observed to see what would happen. So let's talk figures for a second. The deadly pathogens that were released under the order of Dr. Shiro Ishii went on to cause widespread epidemics around China. It's estimated that the death toll caused by these epidemics is between 200 and 580,000 people, most of whom were just civilians. Estimates also put the death toll for the number of people who were tortured and slaughtered directly at Unit 731 between 3,000 and 12,000. Now, that's quite a margin for error there. 3,000 and 12,000, that's a pretty big difference. The reason being, no paperwork or records or anything was kept of the number of people who were brought into Unit 731. So honestly, we just have no idea. Best case scenario, it's 3,000 people. Worst case scenario, it could be more than 12,000 people. We just don't know. One thing we do know for sure, though, is it wasn't just Chinese civilians and prisoners of war that were taken to Unit 731. It's estimated that 30% of the people who died at Unit 731 were Soviet soldiers. Others included Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. It's also estimated that close to 200 American and British soldiers were taken and experimented on at Unit 731 from Japanese prisoner of war camps. And this sort of experimentation went on for years at Unit 731, and in fact was a daily occurrence. There were many other types of experimentation that went on at the unit, and I could list those off. I will list those off. People were deprived of food and water to determine the time until death. Experimented on to determine the relationship between temperature, burns, and human survival. Electrocuted to determine the precise voltage needed to kill a man. Locked in a centrifuge and spun to death to test the effects of G-force on the human body. Injected with varying quantities of animal blood. Exposed to lethal X-rays. Placed in gas chambers and exposed to different chemicals. Injected with seawater for reasons. Burned alive to see how long a person could live while on fire. Now, a lot of these experiments have been described as psychopathically sadistic, with no conceivable military application whatsoever. But for fuck's sake, anyone can see that most of these experiments have absolutely no military application or, in fact, commercial application, and all of them were psychopathically sadistic. It was fucked up what happened at that place. Inevitably, though, every story has to have an ending. We all know the conclusion to this one starts with freedom coming a knocking in the form of a fat man and a little boy. In early August of 1945, the bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. On the 15th of August 1945, Japanese Emperor Hirohito signed Japan's unconditional surrender, which marked the end of their involvement in World War II and also the end of their war against the Chinese. Immediately following the Japanese surrender in World War II, the Japanese demolished Unit 731 in order to cover up any evidence or memory of the atrocities that occurred at the death camp. Ishii, who was still present at the site while it was being demolished, ordered his guards to execute any remaining prisoners. No one was getting out of that place alive, and so, despite the war being over, everyone who was still held captive at the facility was condemned to death. The bodies and body parts of these final executions were buried in a mass grave. Inexplicably, while the Japanese were demolishing the site, they also released thousands of plague-infected rats into the surrounding provinces and millions of plague-infested fleas. This caused one last epidemic in the 3 years that followed the Japanese surrender of World War II, and is estimated to have killed up to 30,000 additional people. After the demolition of Unit 731, realizing that he was going to be prosecuted for war crimes, obviously, Dr. Ishii, the clever fucker that he was, decided to fake his own death and go on the run. He wasn't very good at this, however. In 1946, he was found and he was turned over to American occupation forces. The United States was desperate to not have Shiro Ishii's knowledge on biological weapons fall into the hands of the Soviets. Now, this included all of the results of the medical experimentation he did on humans. They wanted to bolster the knowledge base of their own germ warfare program with all of the results of the biological warfare tests that had happened at Unit 731. After his capture in 1946, and after talking to the Americans, Ishii offered up details of the experimentation that was done at Unit 731, along with the results of those experiments. He did this in exchange for total immunity from any kind of prosecution for the war crimes that he committed while part of the unit. The US gladly accepted this offer, granting him immunity from prosecution for everything that he had done, and even extending this to other high-ranking members of the unit for the knowledge that they had in their individual experiments. More than this, though, the US, as well as offering complete immunity from prosecution, offered these people money and gifts to help entice them to give up all of the information that they had. In a real success story as far as jobs for the boys goes, a lot of Dr. Ishii's staff, who were also dubbed the Devil's Doctors, went on to obtain high-level and influential careers in areas like politics, medicine, business, sectors like that. They took leadership roles at national institutions, well-known national institutions, mind, like the Japanese Medical Association, the National Institute for Health, the National Cancer Center, places like that. If they didn't go on to roles like this, they would obtain quite high-profile roles in the pharmaceutical industry. With the assistance of the British government, the immunity deal that was given to Dr. Ishii and his medical staff was kept secret for years. It wasn't until the 1980s, when information had become so much harder to keep tabs on, that it was largely made public and people started becoming more aware of what happened at Unit 731. So depending on how morbidly curious you are, there are pictures of some of the experiments that were done on people at Unit 731. But in the interest of good taste and not immediately being banned from YouTube, I'm not going to share where you can find those. I'm simply telling you that they are out there if you wanted to look for them. In 1988, Chinese director T.F. Mao created the movie Men Behind the Sun. This movie graphically depicts some of the experimentation, torture, executions, and everything that went on at Unit 731, and is quite notorious for being one of the most gory films ever made. In fact, it's been banned in so many countries and so heavily censored in other countries that I don't think it's possible to obtain a copy in its entirety. One of the reasons, though, that the movie is so controversial is because director T.F. Mao stated that one of the scenes uses actual autopsy footage from the autopsy of a young boy. Another reason is because there's a scene in which a cat is thrown into a room filled with ravenous rats and appears to be eaten alive. It's rumoured that that cat was actually eaten alive by rats. But in 2010, the director appeared in a documentary called Black Sunshine, Conversations with T.F. Mao, and he stated that actually, no, the cat wasn't eaten alive. He was just covered in honey to make him look super wet, and the rats were eating and licking the honey off him, and that after filming concluded, he gave the cat 2 large fish for his trouble, which is kind of sweet if it's true, but I don't know if it is. In 2001, a documentary called Japanese Devils was released. It was created using first-hand accounts of people who actually worked for Unit 731 at the death camp, who were taken prisoner by the Chinese after World War II concluded and were later released. So if you wanted to hear any of the accounts of people who actually were there, that's where you're going to do it. To this day, Japan has not acknowledged Unit 731. In fact, they flat out deny that it ever existed, despite the overwhelming evidence that it did and testimony of people that were there. They just say that any accounts of the things that happened at Unit 731 are wildly exaggerated or completely false. They're just straight up saying, nah, never happened. You're lying. So Shiro's crimes were largely kept a secret. He was never punished for any of them. He was never held accountable for any of the war crimes or atrocities that he committed. So you might be wondering then, where is he now? And why hasn't he been punished now that everything has been brought to light? Well, he died of throat cancer in 1960.